Metaphor ReFantazio is currently sitting pretty in the top 3 games released this year on Metacritic. It has also received 6 nominations at the Game Awards and took away 3 trophies as well. The most notable award it won was for the Best Narrative, and that's what this video will be covering in part. Metaphor's narrative, or more specifically, the themes within that narrative. Now, I've seen some dialogue from people who probably haven't completed the game, telling me that the story could be summed up to quote-unquote, racism is bad. And yes, racism is bad, and racial prejudice is a theme in this game. But I can't get behind the idea that someone played 80 hours of this video game and that was their takeaway. Through gameplay design, art, music, world building, and character writing, Metaphor establishes its thematic emphasis very clearly. And that emphasis is not necessarily about racism. The inequality seen throughout the game exists as a consequence to a more all-encompassing issue that the game tries to tackle, one that has plagued humanity on a micro and macro level for eternity, that being the feeling of anxiety.
Yet, you would give up because you see no other way. We may struggle with fear and anxiety, but we shape our own destiny with our own hands.
We will win this. For the sake of our world!
Again, the world must be shattered, and again it must be rebuilt anew. You will die in tribute to my ideals, Prince.
Just like what I did with SMT5, I won't be covering much of the game part of the video game and save talking about that for a later date. Plus, I'm sure the majority of people who clicked on this are far more interested in dissecting the plot than going over game mechanics other channels have already dissected better than I can. If you have not played Metaphor, I would advise doing so before watching this. Unless, of course, you don't care to be spoiled or have no plans to play the game. I will also be referencing events from other Atlus titles, which I'll put up on screen for those looking to avoid spoilers. Now, let's start this analysis off in the most on-brand fashion possible. That's right, with another Persona 3 segment. Yes, I know I did this last time, but I'll keep it brief and relevant. I do think Persona 3 and Metaphor are comparable in terms of how potent and persistent the themes are. Almost every part of the world feeds into the main message of both games, that being mortality in P3 and anxiety in Metaphor. I think the second most common thing humans struggle with in their lives, aside from death, is fear and anxiety. Maybe there's some causation there. So humor me for a minute while we look at the themes for the first attempt at a calendar system JRPG, which I guess is now officially a thing outside of Persona. Normally when people think about themes in any medium, including games, they do so from a literary perspective, which is almost always of the highest importance. However, themes can also be implemented through artistic vision, music, world building, and mechanics. Using Persona 3 as an example, evoking with a gun as a reminder of death is required to summon personas that protect the main cast in Tartarus, which is named after the underworld in Greek mythology. Time passes with every action you take until your inevitable end. The Velvet Room is an elevator, which in the words of Elizabeth, reaches its destination when the protagonist realizes the answer to life's greatest question. And after he reaches that answer, the end credits roll, accompanied by a song titled Memories of You. I honestly don't even have the time to get into other representations of mortality, such as the fatigue system in FES in the original Persona 3, the multitude of characters that either die or have someone close to them die, the Dark Hour itself, Nyx, etc. The use of time and the calendar system as a gameplay device originated in P3, and played into the game's theme of valuing the time you have alive, no matter how exciting or mundane life could be from day to day. I think the other two modern Persona games have strong themes from an artistic and literary perspective, but doesn't wrap everything into an entirely cohesive package like Persona 3 and Metaphor does with its themes. As I said earlier, Metaphor's theme of dealing with anxiety is something that not just humans, but any conscious being struggles with throughout their lives, no matter who they are. And yes, this game has a lot to talk about, and not all of it is directly regarding anxiety. However, the vast majority of talking points seen throughout the game, such as racial prejudice, classism, religion, and sovereignty, strongly relate to this core theme. For one, the theme of anxiety fits perfectly with the quest to undo the king's curse and then campaign to become king yourself, all while participating in a high-consequence political thriller. The nature of the plot usually provides a greater sense of urgency than its modern Persona counterparts, especially considering that Metaphor's deadlines are shorter, more varied, and more focused than what we've seen before. The attention to detail Hashino, Meguro, and Soejima have applied to previous works when it comes to incorporating themes is still very present here. A specific message that this game frequently relays to the player is that one of anxiety's biggest consequences is stagnation, with its most observable symptoms being inaction and procrastination. An example of how this is reflected in-game is the status ailment anxiety, which essentially gives your enemies more time to get extra attacks in. It comes in the form of a free press turn when targeting an ally afflicted with the status. It's also the only ailment that can be induced by something that happens outside of turn-based combat, as it occurs frequently if you lose the advantage fighting in the overworld. Here's another one. After defeating an enemy or choosing the correct dialogue option in a social interaction, your player will gain Mag. Those who played the game know this, as it's the secondary currency of the game, and one that is used to upgrade and acquire archetypes for battle. What exactly is Mag, you ask? Some Megaten fans thought it was Magnetite or Magatsuhi from previous Atlus games, but no, it's Magla, which is essentially Magnetite and Magatsuhi from previous Atlus games. For those unaware, in non-Persona Megaten titles, there is usually either a mechanic or literary purpose revolving around a physical substance that is emitted by powerful human emotions. Mag, regardless of what it's abbreviated from, is always based on this premise, and it can do a few things. For one, it can manifest into physical beings, like demons themselves. Back when conventional devil summoning was more common in the series, Magnetite was needed as a substance to give demons life. In Nocturne, when Magatsuhi was introduced, the mannequins are literally described as puppets juiced with the stuff. In SMT4, the concept is less relevant, but still shows up in the form of the red pills, which are a more direct and physical way of harvesting emotions.
Specifically, they're neurotransmitters. We suck them out every day at the scheduled time. That's what this whole human farm is for. Get it?
This can apply to pseudo-physical things as well. For example, the palaces seen in the Persona games, which we know are born of subconscious human emotions. We of course know where this applies in Metaphor. The fairies, who I guess are the only SMT demons who survived the magic apocalypse, are noted to be made of Magla. The Igor of this game, and the protagonist himself, is revealed to be made entirely of Magla. In this case, the Magatsuhi or Magnetite needed to make them was manifested through a fantasy novel that carried their dearest ideals. Halfway through the game, you learn that humanity destroyed itself after they learned how to harness Magla, a source of power produced by human emotions, aka Magnetite or Magatsuhi. Then, in the same area, you find a literal, to the T, copy and paste dungeon from the Etrian Odyssey series. The dungeon in question is Lost City Shinjuku, the 5th stratum of the original Etrian Odyssey. And when I say it's a copy and paste, I mean that in the most literal sense. Dungeon design, item placement, and even the FOE mechanic from Etrian Odyssey is untouched. This, by the way, is the same arc where you meet up with the priestess Yufa, who eventually gains the power to summon demons of old, or SMT demons, which means that Metaphor exists as the bridge between the previously unrelated Etrian Odyssey series and the broader Megami Tensei universe. The plot of Etrian Odyssey includes the concept of pollution that is absorbed by Yggdrasil trees. Because of the Metaphor dungeon, we now know that the pollution in question has the same properties that we see from Magla. Metaphor takes place after an apocalypse in a Megami Tensei universe and before Etrian Odyssey. Remember that Etrian Odyssey was not previously considered Megami Tensei. This can become a bigger conversation about the Great Will and stuff like that and Megami Tensei lore, but I would rather not make this an hour-long video. I've also only played one Etrian Odyssey game, so there's probably more stuff I'm missing here. To sum up the connection, Mag, or Magla in Metaphor's case, is usually invisible matter consisting of human thoughts and emotions. The function varies, but the general sense that always gets echoed in these games is that it normally results in danger or eventual calamity. However, the few who could harness the power are capable of shaping the world to their will. Moving on, the majority of bosses you fight are curiously labeled as humans, which are monsters born from what is referred to as a Magla burst. A burst occurs when the substance overwhelms a human. They turn into an abomination of their previous selves. For example, this is seen when Luis casts a spell on the protagonist, which is usually a healing spell but this time used in reverse to corrupt the subject with Magla. The design of most of these humans is based on the work of Hieronymus Bosch, who is often referred to as the creator of monsters as we know them today. Basing the major enemy design on Bosch's work was a unique decision, but one that was thematically relevant to the plot of the game. Through art, he depicted the consequences of sin and failing human morality with the inclusion of intentionally grotesque-looking figures. After all, humanity has a long history of designing creatures meant to invoke fear through things like folklore. Basing the enemies on such an early interpretation of fictitious monsters gives the humans a raw and primitive feel to them. To fight off these monsters in Metaphor, the cast summons archetypes, which are Magla-made embodiments based on stories regarding heroes of old. These include archetypes of commonly seen heroes such as healers, knights, brawlers, gunners, and even devil summoners. This is Atlus's take on Carl Jung's archetype theory, which states that human minds have hereditary models that people grow into as they age. Evidence of this is found in common traits found in mythos and stories from around the world, even before the age of communication that we live in now. Metaphor and Jung both argue that studying these archetypal patterns allows one to gain insight deep into our psyches. This insight enables us to channel these archetypes, leading to personal growth and purpose. So applying this to our reality, how does one learn to embody different archetypes depending on the situation? Metaphor's answer to this is through establishing relationships with a diverse group of people, and each of the 14 followers you create bonds with throughout the game represents a lineage of heroes seen in the past. The inverse of this practice is seen throughout the game in the form of rampant discrimination between tribes. And no, the game highlighting this doesn't mean it's woke or DEI. It's a logical answer to how one could best understand the power that Carl Jung speaks of. By studying the significance of archetypal similarities between varying cultures, tribal, or in our case, racial prejudice, is one of the most prevalent ways anxiety manifests on a holistic scale. When people attach their self-identity and righteousness to a specific ethnic group or ideology, it is often done as a deterrent to anxiety, internal anxiety. The prospect of different ideas and/or individuals who look foreign intersecting with your previously content life is a troubling thought for some. Living in ignorance and labeling these things as dangerous regardless of reality results in a massive group of people falling in line with oppressive institutions. To understand why Metaphor's message is more meaningful and relevant than racism bad, it's essential to understand how Metaphor applies its theme of anxiety to both the individual and the collective. Archetypes in both Jung and Metaphor's case speak to the individual. Sourcing the willpower to operate these archetypes will be a unique experience for each person. The first archetype seen in the game is that of the Seeker, which is the protagonist's archetype as well as Moore's. In the academia research documents, a Seeker is defined as a hero who ventured into the unknown in pursuit of their ideals. This, and any other archetype, is a culmination of all of the types of heroes who fit this description. Applying the concept to the protagonist's story is obvious, as that description could be used as a logline for the game itself. However, the concept applied to the follower Moore is a bit more nuanced, as it implies the failed outcome of the Seeker, someone who embodies this description initially, but ultimately loses their ideals because of their anxiety, and becomes comfortable living in fantasy. To call upon these heroes, a resonant vessel is ripped out of the chest, which looks to be a heart-shaped microphone of sorts. They scream their ideals and motivations into it. A lot of times, anxiety is felt most in the chest area, with symptoms like hyperventilation and contractions occurring. With every awakening scene, the subject either is close to succumbing to their emotions or talks about how they once did so in the past. The imagery of grabbing one's heart and checking it into place is poetic and wholly relevant to each of these characters. The microphone aspect of it is demonstrated best in Stroll's awakening. While he's doing his monologue, a bunch of people randomly show up and start cheering. When I first saw this, I'm not gonna lie, I was really confused. But after completing his follower arc for the entire game, I understand the scene's relevance to what the game considers the quote-unquote solution to anxiety, which is idealism. Stroll, who in my opinion was the pseudo-MC for this entire game, was a noble who lost everything in his life to a rampaging human on his hometown. He grew up carrying the burden of being the last of his noble bloodline for what to him was a dead and failed house. When fighting Captain Klinger, he gathers the courage to face his fear to the point where he would shout about it at the top of his lungs. After doing so, he sees a vision of his dearest ideal, the people of Halia rallying for him after an intense and passionate speech. This moment would be the catalyst for the surviving people of Halia to ultimately find a permanent home thanks to Stroll. This is probably the one character who embodies the themes of the game most potently. Speaking of characters, let's talk about the people of this world, as well as the world building in general, because those two are closely related in this case. Atlus is no stranger to world building through NPC dialogue. My favorite example of this is in Shin Megami Tensei 4, where the world is divided between an area of law-abiding citizens in God's kingdom and another area with no sunlight where chaos and infighting are rampant. The added context of the conditions that both parties live through is abundant in this game, and conversing with as many people as you can gives you fantastic food for thought during the alignment-related sections. You see the good and the bad of both societies while traveling with 3 other samurai, each personifying the 3 alignments of law, neutral, and chaos. Very rarely do you encounter NPC dialogue in this game that is stale or irrelevant. While I don't think Metaphor does this as extensively as SMT4 does, Uchronia's politics were pretty interesting, albeit not really original. It was bolstered by factors within the world, like the struggle between tribes and the focus on the theme of anxiety. Most notably though, it allows us to make comparisons to real life without making too many equivalencies to real groups of people. You can't say that the Papyrus, the Rusant, or the Ujifs have any surface level visual similarities to races in our reality. I'd assume pigment is purposely varied across all tribes for this specific reason. This is a good segue into discussing another major talking point in Metaphor: theocratic authoritarianism and religious sacrifice. These subjects are present throughout the game, but are most relevant in the Virga Island and Alterberry arcs. The theocratic institution in Metaphor is the Sanctus Church. Sanctism is a monotheistic religion that has always existed in the world of Metaphor, but gained significant traction during the stagnant rule of Hyphlodius V. Taking advantage of the king's apathy, Forden, the religion's leader, asserted that Sanctism be declared the official state religion, which then snowballed to the point where the king had little power outside of the royal scepter. Sanctism's function in society is to hide the old world's truth and maintain order. My biggest criticism of this game is that no real creation myth or dogma is established for Sanctism, which are 2 very critical parts of establishing real-life theocratic states. Regardless, Sanctism still serves its literary purpose, as its sole purpose is to exact control over people and information. An example of Sanctism's prerogative includes the creation of magic igniters. This is essentially corporate slop Magla that anybody can use, regardless of the heroics usually required to wield such a thing. Have you ever wondered why the igniter shop is pretty much filled with grossly overpriced crap? It's not that the game doesn't want you to buy these igniters, but rather focus on the real thing. These give the institution an excuse to profit off the fact that they are selling people a cheap version of magic. Even though they are preventing another Magla-related disaster, it's resulting in the stagnation of society. Humanity destroying itself is obviously an event powerful enough to pave the way for something like Sanctism to exist. It's a truth that would be very difficult for us to internalize if it were to be true. The point Metaphor makes is not that religion is bad, but that institutionalizing religion leads to a society where its principles are built upon as fact, leaving no room for discourse, and an increased chance of toxic religious righteousness. One of the tribes that exclusively do not follow Sanctism is the Mustari, which has a third eye allowing them to see Magla. The Sanctists go so far to deny historical reality that their prayer posture includes the covering of where their third eye would be if they happen to be Mustari. I understand that some people get upset by the fact that Atlus doesn't really paint monotheistic religion in a good light, and to that I say you are absolutely right in thinking that's the case. However, there are reasons for that, and most of them are cultural. So if you're curious about the topic, I'd recommend watching this video. The only thing I will say is that Metaphor isn't attacking your religion, but rather giving the very reasonable advice of not letting religious institutions dictate truth. To those who have a problem with that message, well, maybe the problem is that it hit a bit too close to home. The one thing that I would consider a Sanctism W is that it drives the character arcs for the most unique Atlus characters in recent memory, the Priestess Yufa and Batlin the Crier. Now some of you might be thinking, who invited blood? But seriously, I don't even think I can name a better minor character out of the Atlus games I've played in recent memory. Batlin was the official Sanctus Crier, which is essentially the public mouthpiece for the church. When gathering information for the royal tournament, he develops an interest in the MC and his entourage. He helps them out here and there, but things really shift for him during the Virga Island arc. He discovers that the religion he's promoting is not only fabricated, but its express purpose is to hide the truths found in the quote-unquote correct pagan folklore of the Mustari people. After learning this, he reflects on the life of his father, who was a crier himself. He was labeled a liar and killed for whistleblowing on an operation conducted by the Sanctists, one that experimented on the papyrus of the lower class. Eventually, through pursuing his true ideals and desiring the freedom of information, he eventually completes his arc from a Sanctus parrot to a seeker of truth. Yufa, or Euphausia, is the priestess of Virga Island, soon to be named Etria. The pagan religion they follow worship Et, the dragon god, which unlike Sanctism's god is a physical entity made out of Magla. Yufa's character arc is fairly similar to Batlin's, but bolstered by one of the better follower bonds in the game. Despite holding the quote-unquote more correct belief, Yufa's relationship with religion becomes much more complicated than Batlin's. The people of Virga Island have a tradition of sacrificing a priestess to Et. Like I said with Sanctism, the depth of this religion is pretty non-existent aside from the creation myth that isn't actually a creation myth. And the game unrealistically portrays how an indigenous community would receive the news that their beliefs are flawed. Similarly though, it is thematically relevant. Dragons, being made entirely of Magla, are manifestations of fear. The calamity associated with them invoked a primal sense of dread that only the truest of heroes could overcome. Yufa sacrificing herself to this entity may temporarily alleviate the anxiety of her people, but it's inevitable that without facing the core issue, the problem will never disappear, and it seemingly didn't for millennia.
Dragons are manifested avatars of mortal fear. Fear of nature. Fear of the untamed. That is the source of their power. If you would be king, show me you can conquer it.
Everything I've mentioned in this video so far about thematic emphasis in this game is really just complimentary stuff. The real meat and bones of what this story wants to talk about is found in the story of the main villain and two of the most relevant objects in the game: Luis, the Royal Scepter, and the unnamed fantasy novel. Let's start with Luis, who I can't believe hasn't even been mentioned up until now. It goes without saying that Luis is the most important character in this game, especially in regard to the thematic emphasis of anxiety. What makes Luis such a good character is that his motivations as a villain are completely understandable and realistic given the situation of his life and the world of metaphor. He grew up in an Elden sanctum and was raised by a house of healers. At a very young age, Forden and the Sanctus Church tried to ruin his life on two separate occasions. Firstly, and most egregiously, his entire village gets burned down for quite literally no reason. It was not done from a place of hate, just unjustified destruction. Then, once he gets his life together and begins rising up the military ranks, Forden falsely pins the prince's murder on him, further condemning his life. When you talk to Luis about Forden, he doesn't lash out or become emotional in the slightest. He obviously despises Forden and matter-of-factly states that he'll kill him one day, but it doesn't come from a place of personal hatred. He believes that Forden is only a part of a much larger machine that needs to be removed for the sake of the kingdom, that being Sanctism. Luis does not become a tyrant because he receives pleasure from the suffering of others, he truly sees it as a necessary evil. In fact, Luis doesn't show any truly sadistic qualities in the sense that when he does kill someone, or even a group of people, it's only done in the name of his vision, which is to develop what he calls new humans. He will do this by driving concentrated Magla into the bodies of the populace. Whoever can confront the pain of having their bodies altered will turn into more powerful and intelligent beings. Zorba in the final act of the game would be an example of this. Those who can't face this will turn into giant, mindless monsters, the ones that we see throughout the game. In its most simple terms, Luis wants a reset of humanity in a trial by fire, where the anxious and weak will die out and only the strong will remain, resulting in powerful new humans with a greater sense of individuality. He sees Sanctism as essentially the result of mass groups of people being too weak to accept reality. What makes Luis so scary is that he never succumbs to this anxiety at any point. Even during his Magla burst, which is usually caused by uncontrolled anxiety, can be explained away since he was overpowered by the immense Magla involved with weaponizing the royal scepter. Even after he becomes human, his will supersedes his form, as Destroyer Cadarius is the only human monster in the game that will actually talk to the party. Not only that, but he coherently states that this is necessary, telling the prince that he will die in tribute to his ideals. The game is basically saying that even though pursuing ideals is how humans can truly be free, the ideals themselves can come from anywhere. And as long as you wholeheartedly believe what you're doing is righteous, your ideals hold the power to overcome any anxiety, whether that anxiety is placed within you in good faith or otherwise. So to wrap this whole theme into a nice bow, let's talk about the most important factor in the entire story, the Royal Scepter. It is by no mistake that in the first few minutes of open exploration, the game forces you to walk by the Magic Igniter shop, which houses a model of the Royal Scepter. The function of the Royal Scepter is to absorb the Magla, aka anxiety and other negative emotions, from the populace, presumably as a means to strengthen the crown's defenses while keeping the destructive properties of Magla at bay. The issue with this is that the concept is flawed considering how anxiety and other negative emotions operate. It is a temporary solution that snowballs into a disaster, as you cannot remove the anxiety output, so to speak, without addressing the issues that cause the anxiety to emanate in the first place. The result of this is the total amount of Magla from the populace increasing to make up for the displaced anxiety that the scepter absorbs. With the scepter being unable to intake any more Magla, the air becomes polluted with shards of the stuff. If you haven't realized, the game really likes to abundantly use these Magla effects to drive the point home. For me, the best moment of the entire game is after you kill Louise for good, and the final shot of the scene is the Royal Scepter disintegrating into the atmosphere. What the game asks us with this shot, on an individual and collective level, is the following. Can we get rid of our own Royal Scepter? Whatever that is for each person. Are humans capable of managing anxiety, or do we always need to project it onto something else, like a group of people, for example, or a specific religious belief? Metaphor argues that if solving this problem is possible, idealism and fantasy is the way that it could be achieved. It does not sound realistic, rationally speaking. That's the point. With works of fiction similar to this, you often hear that things like true equality won't ever exist, and that making a game where such a thing seems feasible is nothing more than a fantasy. Convincing humanity on a mass scale to pursue their true ideals, absent from the influence of things like religious dogma and social constructs, that's utterly ridiculous. And yes, maybe you're right, the prospect of that truly happening is ridiculous. But the only world where such a scenario exists is one where mass groups of people find the power within themselves individually to confront their anxieties. Where do you find that power? In the same way that the characters of Metaphor did. They harnessed their anxiety and confronted the world's pain by embodying the essence of heroes, the archetypes. Depending on who you are, you may or may not know people in your life who embody the same virtues that a hero would. Regardless, there is one place where you could always find the blueprint for such things, and that is in fantasy. There is a meta-narrative aspect to this game for sure. It's very intentional. And it's important to understand that the game wants you to apply it to your reality. Fantasy in itself could be used as a means to shield yourself from anxiety. I, for one, am prone to immersing myself in another world so I don't need to confront my real-life fears all the time. What's important is that I and everyone else who played the game come out of the experience with a different perspective. Maybe all of this is futile, but the only scenario where our futures are truly out of reach is one where we succumb to our doubts and anxieties and idealism dies. I'll leave you with a quote from Carl Jung himself. Fantasy seems to me the clearest expression of the specific activity of the psyche. It is, preeminently, the creative activity from which the answers to all answerable questions come. It is the mother of all possibilities, where, like all psychological opposites, the inner and outer worlds are joined together in living union. Fantasy it was and ever is, which fashions the bridge between the irreconcilable claims of subject and object, introversion and extroversion. In fantasy alone, both mechanisms are united.